Maybe a good place to start would be to talk about your upcoming album with Toned,
Mhm.
which I have been able to listen to. I think it's awesome. It's really amazing. It's one of your perhaps more ambitious releases yet with that group. The sonic palette is so broad and diverse, and it also has video and poetry within it. Can you talk a little bit about the process that went into making this album, particularly about your thinking that you write in the program notes on moving towards a completely restructured and highly personalized sonic destination born from a collective distrust in the canons of present day art forms and commonly ingested sound principles?
Well, a bit of that's jargon, but I mean I think it does definitely come from a certain kernel of honesty in that. But I mean, a lot of the way we do stuff is just based on the idea of trying to have like the band model without actually, rehearsing every week, because the Leo, our drummer, is based in Philadelphia, and Nathan and I are both in the Bay Area. So we basically, I mean, we meet up a couple of times a year, and it's usually centered around some performance or performances that we're doing, and then I suppose the process is we sort of, kick around a bunch of ideas, and usually there's like a multi-stage process in doing that, where all of us will come in with sometimes, even notated material, although that's rare. It's usually just ideas for sound worlds to get into, and then we'll just go in and maybe rehearse it a little bit, but then record a number of different takes of some idea, and then while in the studio, maybe refining them, um, along with just a large dose of free improvisation. So there's a mix between predetermined material in there that is as it is, and then a whole bunch of improvised material. But then I suppose there's another layer of composition that happens after the first layer of composition, which is bringing ideas. The second layer is composing in real time with improvisation. And the third layer is taking all of those and basically putting them together into what's really just a piece of tape music, I suppose. Um, but the big thing about that is it allows sort of all three of us, Nathan Corder, Leo Suarez, and myself, to kind of all bring our strengths into it without really having to dilute those too much by the other members of the band. So the improvisation lets us all, share our unique vocabularies, as well as the unique, group interaction that happens just after a couple of years of playing together. But the tape, the part where it becomes a piece of tape music, and ultimately the album that someone can listen to, is kind of, it ends up being a months long, fairly arduous process. That's a lot of it is done with just us hanging out and listening to it and saying, like, well, what if we put this here? And then, what if we had this wild idea? And like, we brought in our friend Michael Barr, who's a poet, to add sort of another layer of complexity and interest to all of this music. So I suppose, but part of it, the distrust in received notions of art is what any form of music is necessarily supposed to sound like. And I know this is kind of old hat at this point, but I think all three of us do have a sort of, in certain ways, I don't think any of us have a really certain idea of what music is supposed to be at all anymore, except with references to certain specific, like, historical styles or anything. So the piece is just what we allow it to be, and what we allow all like the other two members of the band to whatever ideas they want to bring in. So I don't know if yeah, I had a stronger idea of what I wanted to say there, but I think that makes sense.
So the ideas for adding the text and adding the video, those came as a result of the process. Those weren't initially conceived that you were going to do something this way when you went into the studio.
Well, some of them were recorded in the studio. I suppose there is a certain idea of creating, like, even within the piece itself, kind of a cybernetic structure of just anything we're thinking of at any time. So some idea, I suppose an idea could come at any point in the process. So I mean, it's different in that way from like sitting down to write, you know, a piece of music for a cellist or a saxophonist, where it's the composer basically has to have the idea all the way through. An idea could be something as simple as like, you know, what if we played these three notes really loudly, and then in the studio there's no real idea of what we're going to do with that, but in putting together the piece, that could just come suddenly in the middle of an improvisation, is just that gets structured in there, and suddenly this becomes like a sort of leitmotif that carries out through the entire album. So there's a layering of processes, and like a lot of this will happen, you know, Nathan will have a go at a particular track, and then Leo will listen to it and say like, well, what if we, you know, cut out this part here and inserted this part from like an improvisation we did on a totally different day. And then there's like a restructuring of the piece, and then maybe I'll go through and listen to it and say like, well, what if we put in this, you know, this like heavy metal section that we composed like right in the middle of this thing, and then suddenly we have a completely different form than even the like very structured ideas we brought in. Those are now completely recontextualized, and pretty rapidly whatever sense of like you know, in organic listening experience of listening to free improvisation, this now becomes completely indistinguishable from any pre-composed ideas we had before. And then if you start adding in, you know, extra musical things, like on several of our albums we have like a lot of field recording stuff, and sometimes it's even field recordings of us just talking to people or whatever. Or like the poetry, which Michael's been, I think he's been a part of a couple of our recorded pieces now. So he's sort of the unofficial fourth member of Toned in a way. But bringing that, then it's like, obviously there's nothing, you know, as soon as you bring text into anything, even if it's gobbledygook, a listener is going to start listening to that in a different way than they'll listen to a piece of music. I mean, so if you add that in, it's suddenly recontextualizing even this like layered tape piece that we've already created for ourselves. And for a listener, I mean, I guess I think there is a shared idea that we don't really want to we don't want to force a listener into listening to the music in any particular way. And there's an idea of trying to let anyone who may be listening to it make up their own mind about what's happening, or what the you know, the sense of this music is, if that makes sense.
I'm wondering, like in this process, and this may be similar to what Kyle asked before, but do you keep in mind in the process that you're going to be creating a tape piece, kind of like album experience out of this? Or do you just, you're freely improvising and you're not thinking about that last step in the process as you're creating?
I think that goes back to just like the sort of tagline of the non-hierarchical compositional process, is that at certain points in like making the thing, different, even the members of the band may have different objectives of what they're thinking about. So I mean, we've discussed this a little bit before, and I don't want to, make it seem like this is the only way we work, but Leo, for instance, a lot of the time, because he's a very, very, very dedicated and very good free improviser. And I think a lot of the times what he's thinking about with the ideas that he brings in is sort of like the immediate sense of the sound, which is, in that case, a lot of the things that he's thinking about are more concerned with what happens when we actually perform the piece that he's thinking of, and then it gets captured, and then what happens with that is maybe more of a we'll see what happens. I often am thinking of the end result of creating this tape piece, so a lot of my ideas are paradoxically less abstract, but also the a lot of the things I bring in ahead of time end up not being, the meat of a particular part of the piece. They end up being more of the, the little turkeys that you throw in there to throw things off track. And then but it's really, I mean, I have to give credit where credit's due. Nathan is sort of the electronicist of the group, so it's a lot of the structural stuff, at least at the first stage of taking it out of the studio, is when he starts to put in a lot more formal ideas. And then there's kind of a group, composition of how we rearrange those afterwards. So there's a mixture of both. Is sometimes we're just totally, we're playing free and seeing what happens. Sometimes the ideas are completely based in a sound world that's in the room at the time. And sometimes the ideas are meant to just add to whatever form the album is going to take in its end result, but without necessarily any clear picture of how that's going to materialize. We just kind of collect all the material and then put it together in a way.
When you head out to perform the music from the album, then is it like a process of going back and relearning what you put on the album and trying to play, basically a composition that's true to the album? Or do you give yourself a lot of space to make something that's totally in the moment when you're performing, works from the album live?
We've kicked that idea around, and we have done that a little bit, of basically going back and learning the album and playing it live. There's some amount of impossibility in doing that, because at the end of the day, when we play live, we're still drums, guitar, and saxophone trio, and obviously there's a lot more happening in the sonic palette of all of these. I think more often what happens is that we'll have a performance, or like a tour that we've set up, and we'll just spend a few days rehearsing and essentially composing a new set of music. And I think that works also because this is a common theme to, I think, like any group of improvisers, especially if you're not rehearsing every week, and you're getting together maybe a couple of times a year. Part of the excitement of all of that is bringing in whatever new developments may have arisen in everyone's individual practice. So I think when it comes to the live performance, that's more often what happens, is that we'll just spend a few days rehearsing, and then the initial process with that is just we sort of reacquaint ourselves with ourselves, and just like get back into a group improvisation and figure out where we're at that particular time. But then we will go on to sort of structure that more into a set that's that we can play for, you know, whatever the length of the tour is.
I'm wondering if we could take a step back and I'm curious to know about how or what led you to your improvisatory practices, or is that how you started making music originally, or how did you get to the place where you were, I guess, focusing on improvisation?
Sure. I mean, I think like many people, I mean, the first great musical obsession that I had when I was pretty young, maybe, I don't know, 7 years old or something, was listening to Jimi Hendrix. And that was kind of the foundational principle for how I even conceived music was made. So, I mean, from the very outset of me even beginning to listen to music, I did start to have an idea that the act of making music was, you compose your own music, you perform on it on your instrument, and then you improvise over the pieces you composed. And obviously then, like, you know, switching from guitar to saxophone and listening to, I mean, no offense to anything, but I think the most interesting literature in saxophone music is, you know, American musicians usually improvising and composing their own pieces. So that just kind of reinforced that whole idea. And it honestly wasn't even until much later when I started to, you know, go to school and get really interested in composition that I mean, I was aware it existed, but I wasn't intimately familiar with the idea that maybe you could write a piece of music and somebody else would play it, and they would play it, you know, more or less exactly how you wrote it out. That was more of a new idea to me than the idea of what music was. It's just you write your own pieces, you play them, and then you improvise over them. So in that sense, improvisation was kind of always part of the deal for me. And obviously, the, you know, like when I was a teenager or whatever, there was a lot of just, you know, jamming, Grateful Dead style, which now, you know, I could see is a form of free improvisation in a way, although I'm not sure if it's very interesting. But yeah, that was always part of the thing. And I guess the interest in a lot of these more, you know, historically stylistic traditions, eventually, you know, one thing led to another. And I discovered, you know, first Albert Eiler and Ornette Coleman, and then going on a lot of the more intense stuff like Cecil Taylor probably led me into, you know, some of the European guys and the English guys, until I got to this point. But in short, I suppose you could say that I started with an idea that improvisation was always part of music.
How much does improvisation factor into your compositional process? I mean, a lot of your works are somewhat non-fixed. Do you also have more fixed, concrete music that people perform, or is it always very collaborative when you are composing?
Um, no, I have, yeah, I have a lot of pieces that are essentially through composed beginning to end. I think that I mean, you're absolutely right that a lot of them are heavily based in improvisation. But even some of the more fixed pieces, they now involve at many points in the process, at least, choices for the performer to make. And the looseness of those choices, I suppose, one way I could conceive of it is that if you sit down to write a piece of music for a performer, it could be one way, or it could be literally an infinite number of possibilities of any other way you do it. As the composer, if you're sitting down, you know, if you write a middle C, that could be a C in any other octave, or it could be any of the other 11 notes, or it could be maybe now we're not an equal temperament. So it's like that C could be literally any other pitch on the spectrum of human hearing. And if you take that and, you know, spiral it out, it's kind of, for me at least, and I think that part of that has to do with the fact that I am an improviser and perform some of my own compositions. I think a lot of this comes down to, I want to boil down whatever composition I'm writing to the basic ideas that I'm trying to get across. And a lot of that comes down to just like certain kernels of material that I'm working with. So I actually, two of the more recent pieces I've written are for piano solo, and both of them, they're very different takes on the same idea, but both of them deal with a few kernels of material that are developed, but that lead to essentially an open section that boils down those pieces of materials into their basic units, and basically ask the performer to rearrange those at will. And to me, if I follow my own idea, it's more that like I could sit down and keep rearranging these pieces of material in any infinite number of ways, but I've tried to structure the pieces to, I have my little development process. Sometimes it's, you know, mathematical or proportional, but it sort of leads inevitably to a point where all of these different pieces of material are interacting, and I want the performer now to just engage in their own development of these materials and then maybe get back to the piece. So it's not, and increasingly I feel this way about music. The improvisation in itself is not necessarily where the interest lies. The improvisation is more a means to an end, if you will. It's a technique, but within these pieces, it's the improviser is still working with the kernels of idea that I have as a composer. And I think it's, you know, it's different when you're working with like an atonal new music piece that's, you know, using all of these like complicated tuplets and, you know, different tone rows and stuff, and like mathematical structures, etc. The sound is different, but the basic idea of, well, let's play ahead and then improvise on the base materials of that piece, which are the chord changes, and that's the development, and then let's go back and play the head. It's essentially, it's not the same, but it's a very similar process. Is the head is me, you know, putting together these tone rows and like playing through this extrapolation thing. And then the development section is, well, I'll let the performer just deal with all of these materials themselves and then go back and play this ending that I've composed. And I mean, I think the same way works in a Charlie Parker solo. A lot of people could disagree with me, but it's not necessarily, if you're listening to it on record, that he's improvising that's so interesting to me. It's the fact of what he's improvising, is that he's, you know, just playing these beautiful, incredible melodies and all of these like these beautiful, you know, extensions on the chord changes and stuff. So if I'm not just rambling, I increasingly within written music, I don't want to improvise just to improvise. I want to either ask a performer to improvise or improvise myself with some end result in mind of creating music, which I think is different from even a lot of things that I've been very heavily influenced and inspired by. But like the Derek Bailey approach, for instance, I think is very different to that. And I think he did have some sense of wanting to improvise just to improvise, and sort of taking any sort of ego out of it and just letting what happens happens. At least the current time, I'm kind of trying to put a certain amount of ego back in there, and not necessarily something as trite as, you know, telling a story or something, but I have a musical objective that I'm trying to reach, and the improvisation is a technique to try to achieve that.
In a way, that sounds really parallel, or I guess similar to the process that you described in coming up with your toned album material, right? You bring in these ideas and then you extend them out. So are you, when you're writing pieces for, or writing through composed pieces, or so-called through composed pieces, are you collaborating with people closely, or are you often writing pieces for nobody in mind and then they end up being performed? I'm just curious about if you're like commissioned to write stuff and you have the specific performer in mind as you compose.
I think it's usually better if that's the case. And there was a certain period, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, where I was kind of writing pieces more, I don't know, just for the instrumentation rather than the players. And pretty quickly that became a problem in a certain way. Not a problem, I shouldn't say a problem, but I mean, I can think of one piece. I was writing a piece for an ensemble in St. Petersburg, and they're amazing musicians. I mean, Russian musicians have chops for forever. So I was kind of like, well, I can write whatever I want for these guys, right? You know, and they'll be able to play it, they'll be able to shred it. And anything that was, you know, just sort of notes and rhythms on paper, they could play very well. But I also, at the same time, I, you know, had all of these ideas, and as like a woodwind player myself, obviously I have this whole, you know, bag of extended techniques that like I can dip into. And I was kind of solipsistic in writing that piece, just thinking like, well, if I can do it, then this guy who is a much better clarinet player than I'll probably ever be at the saxophone, he can do it. And of course that, you know, wasn't true, because the notation that I showed him, and even like I, you know, brought my mouthpiece and said like, no, you do this, you go, and it just didn't work. So in that sense, and I'm not trying to call out that specific ensemble or anything, so I won't name them, but the flip side of that, of actually, you know, working with a performer who at very least, just knowing that they're sort of like down to try whatever you're going to throw at them, and they'll have an attitude of like, yeah, I want to do that, and I want to try to do that, and I want to try to learn the piece, and whatever's taken from learning the piece works a lot better. And working with someone who has like a very unique vocabulary on your instrument, you can kind of essentially write a piece for whatever it is that person does. But I'm also totally okay with working, and I have done this, and those piano pieces are good examples of what I'm thinking about, the ones that I just mentioned. In those cases, they were, new music pianists, and actually, one of them, this amazing Spanish piano player, his name's Ricardo Descalzo. Like, when I talked to him before even writing the piece, he talked to me, and he was like, well, he looked at like some of my work, and he saw that I'm a saxophone player, etc. And he said, like, well, I'd really like to, and this was his suggestion, I'd like to incorporate improvisation into this sometime. And he was also saying, and this is, I think a lot of, classical or new music instrumentalists, they do this thing where they say they've never improvised before, and they say like, oh no, I could never improvise like that. But then it's like, I mean, these are some of like the most technically proficient musicians on the planet. And it almost seems like really all you have to do is write on the paper, like, now improvise, and then they can treat that like they're reading the improvisation. And if you say something as simple as just like, I don't, just like go wild, just like don't think about it, just move your hands, then suddenly, you can get these pianists who a second ago were claiming that like, oh, I've never improvised before, this is a new thing. And suddenly it's like, well, all right, you sound like fucking Cecil Taylor now, just because I said like hit the keys really hard. And it's like, so the getting a little off the cuff there, but I think that that's what I meant to say is that it doesn't necessarily, the piece doesn't necessarily need to be playing exactly to whatever this person's bag of tricks is. It's more an attitude, and as long as you're asking someone to do something that they can do, even if they don't think they could a second ago, as long as they're sort of down to try it, that's the more important thing. So, I mean, to get back to the question, I guess essentially through trial and error, I realized that even my strong suit as a composer is not necessarily trying to write the piece, the 10-minute piece from beginning to end with every note written exactly where it should be. And, trying to do that, like, putting in the tablature for a certain multiphonic or something. It's I think like I was saying earlier, it works a lot better for me to boil the ideas down to smaller kernels, and then really there's still, a ton of through composition and precisely notated music, but it sort of works a lot better if I play to my strong suits, which are, understanding in my own way how an improvised passage results in music, or what the building blocks of that are, and also playing to the performer's strong suit, which is not necessarily trying to have them play a bunch of multiphonics that they don't know, or extended techniques that I'm going to try to teach them how to do. So yeah, I hope that makes sense in some way.
So to generalize a little bit more about collaboration, I'm wondering, what is it you look for in a collaborator, whether it's someone who's going to perform your composed music or someone you're improvising with or playing in a band with regularly? Like, what do you look for in a collaborator?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, that question can be answered in many ways, but I do think a lot, because I studied for a number of years with Roscoe Mitchell at Mills College, and he had a lot of, you know, these sort of amazing kernels of wisdom. I still think he's the best teacher I've ever had, whether it's in composition, improvisation, whatever. And this may be a little bit apocryphal, so well, okay, well, I'll quote, but just know that it may be a paraphrase of his words, but I feel something similar. Is he at one point said, when it comes to like improvised music, I think he said, I only fuck with high speed motherfuckers. And I think part of that, what he meant by that, and I've dealt with this too, is at least with me and my practice in improvisation, I don't necessarily want to sit and wait for someone to do something, and I don't want the improvisation to become a reactive process, because that's not so interesting to me. And I don't really like I shouldn't say that. At least for my own practice, I'm less interested in the type of improvisation where, you know, someone plays a note and then the other person sits there and listens to the note and then responds to the note, and then maybe they respond. Or especially the type of following thing where, you know, one saxophone player starts, you know, playing a multiphonic, and then the other saxophone player starts playing a different multiphonic, and then they keep doing that. I don't like the following thing. I like for everyone to be simultaneously following their own logic and bringing themselves into it and following their own sort of path through the music. And that definitely doesn't mean not listening. I just, looking for collaborators, especially with improvised music, I want people to have a really strong sense of their own vocabulary and really their own personality. You know, I mean, it's funny how much a musical personality almost always ends up reflecting the sort of human personality of the person playing the music. And that's something Ornette Coleman talked about all the time. But like Ornette, or like, you know, Roscoe said, or really, I think it's a common thing with all of the AACM guys. I want a collaborator not in any way to be subservient to my ideas or something, because I'm not so interested in my ideas. I'm much more interested in other people's ideas, especially if they're interesting and well thought out. And when you're dealing with this music, which is, I mean, there's no two ways about it. It is pretty advanced music, and it's, you know, we're out on the edge here. It's not like laying into a groove. I think at that point, anyone who's dealing with it honestly, they should have their own idea of what they're doing. And I want to, even if it's sort of like a violent musical confrontation, I want them to be really, you know, self-assured in what they're doing. And there's I don't know, this is sort of a random thought, but like there's a really interesting recording that Derek Bailey made later in his career. He made it with G. Calvin Weston and Jamaluddin Takuma. It's called Miracle, and it's Jamaluddin and G. Calvin. They're kind of like, they're doing this like primetime funk groove music like the whole time, and it's like really amazing musicianship, but it's like it's really in the pocket. And then Derek Bailey is just kind of doing Derek Bailey on top of that. And I think it's like, it might be my favorite Derek Bailey album. And like I think it's so sick, and I think the music works really well. And the reason I bring that up is because it's like, it seems like these disparate things, and maybe like they're at cross purposes, but that's what I like in improvised music, is that Jamaluddin and G Calvin on that is like they're doing their thing, and this is like the vocabulary from working with Ornette's Prime Time, and like they're doing that, and that is so strong. And then Derek Bailey is doing Derek Bailey, and he's always, you know, just doing that, and like that's such a strong, unique vocabulary that if you just put that together and nobody's like, you know, wondering like, is this any good? Is this going anywhere? It's just like, no, you're doing it. That almost always results in the type of music that I like. And this, I suppose that doesn't even have to apply strictly to like freely improvised or even improvised music at all. It's if a composer writes a piece and they have a really strong idea of what they're trying to do with the piece, and then the performer is completely assured in dealing with the material and interpreting the material, and is playing in a really strong way, that's going to be a compelling piece of music, even if it's, you know, 15 minutes of whole notes with fermatas on them and nothing else. It's, as long as everyone, you know, knows what they're doing, I think it's going to work.
What is extreme music?
Well, I mean, I suppose the term extreme music, as I use it, because I do use that to describe a number of different practices. It kind of comes. Do you guys know the band Morbid Angel? They're a death metal band from Florida. They're great. But they had sort of a motto, and it's like they have shirts that have the Morbid Angel logo on the front, and then all along the back in like really huge impact font so that it covers the entire back, it just says extreme music for extreme people. And I think that's like such a great motto, and I think in many ways that is really what I'm interested in. Is I bring that up because the term extreme music comes from extreme heavy metal, I suppose, which is, but I can apply it to any number of things. I mean, I think, you know, Boulez is extreme music. I think, you know, 433 is a piece of extreme music. I think Namjoon Pike, you know, those sort of hypothetical compositions, or even the ones that, you know, he did of like, you know, slicing your arm open and stuff, that's definitely extreme music. But I guess when it comes to my own practice, it's more about taking whatever your idea is to the maximum, and kind of subtlety be damned in a certain sense. And it's definitely not to say that's the only thing I'm interested in, or the only thing I like, but as a practice, a lot of the music is, well, there's literal things like trying to deal with like extreme ranges of the saxophone. So I mean, on the solo record that I came out with a couple of years ago, one of the tracks is literally just extreme altissimo for however long it is. I don't know, like 3 minutes. And it's honestly like even I think it's kind of annoying, but like that's sort of the point. The point isn't to annoy people. It's just to kind of like, I don't know. It's to try to reach the limits of whatever material you're dealing with. And I think some of that comes, I mean, like I was saying, a big part of that comes from just liking extreme heavy metal, but it's like, I think a lot of experimental music, and especially a lot of like American experimentalism, like I don't know, a lot of the stuff that like the AACM guys did, or Albert Eiler just absolutely, you know, tearing the saxophone apart to like push these like physical extremes to like get to this realm where in some ways he's one of the first saxophone players to be dealing with sound instead of notes. I think a lot of that comes with just pushing things to the extreme, and it's not about the volume per se, it's that that volume leads the saxophone to like open up all of these different overtones and like start getting into all of these different timbral things that are like very different from a sort of classical idea of the saxophone is just kind of a louder clarinet. And I think I don't know, I vibe with that a lot. And there's definitely some idea of like there's sort of a famous essay that Foucault wrote about Georges Bataille about the notion of transgression and how trying to transgress limits simultaneously defines limits. And that's the, I don't think, thinking about stuff like that, of like trying to find the limits of music are very interesting to me. And I mean, I think that's in line with like any number of things. So I said, like, you know, to me, Boulez is extreme music, is like even this whole project of serialism and stuff. One way to conceive of that is just trying to find, you know, new combinations of equal tempered notes that haven't been found before through a sort of methodical process. And obviously there's a lot more to that, or a lot less to that, depending on who you ask. But yeah, the extreme music is trying to find the limits of what we can do with music, I suppose.
Who are some of your current, or who, I shouldn't just say who and what are your current influences or obsessions creatively?
Well, recently I've been digging back into some sort of old favorites, but definitely the answer that springs to mind is there's a saxophone player who's lived in Boston for a number of years now. His name is Jim Hobbs. He's mostly an alto player, but he has a band that he calls the Fully Celebrated Orchestra, which is kind of funny because it's just a saxophone, bass, and drums trio. Although he's added trumpet. Taylor Ho Bynum plays trumpet in the group, I think, pretty regularly now. But I don't know, for anyone who hasn't checked out this work, and that group hasn't put out an album in a number of years, but they were really active in the late 90s through the 2000s. I think Jim Hobbs is, I'll go out on a limb and say, I think he's the most underrated and underknown saxophone player in the world, because he's an absolute monster. I think he can, you know, he can play changes as well as anyone, you know, playing at the Village Vanguard, and he knows every single one of the tricks, and he's made up any number of extended techniques that I don't think I've heard anyone else do before. And just like absolute monster technique. And what's more impressive is that he has just bonkers ideas, and when you listen to him play, it's like it really is that thing where it's like he's never going to do the same thing the same way twice. There's a real sense of everything happening is like genuinely spontaneous. Like, you know, Sonny Rollins has that quality to me. but his compositions are wild too, because he studied composition, and it's something that I've definitely kind of always been in, which is like doing these, you know, highly experimental and highly technical pieces, but with like a sort of irreverence to them. So it's like, you know, they'll play these incredibly tight compositions that are using like wild extended techniques, but they're also kind of like sort of like a goofy cartoon version of that. And there's like, you know, sometimes like silly musical quotes in them. But Jim Hobbs, definitely, he's amazing. I first heard about him when I was studying in Boston for a couple of years, and he, at that time, which was now many years ago, he was like such a massive influence on everything that I thought about. And in many ways, I credit him almost single-handedly with like leading me into a lot of more experimental improvisers and stuff. But I'm sort of revisiting his work right now, and it's blowing my mind even more than it did, you know, when I first encountered it 10 years ago. And I mean, on a similar thread of, you know, rediscovering old favorites, I've been listening to a ton of Duke Ellington, and I don't know, I've been like transcribing some Johnny Hodges solos and stuff like that. Sonny Rollins as well. And I know these are maybe not exciting answers, but I think I at least personally, in terms of like work, because I don't know, things are starting to pick up a little bit, at least like in the Bay Area. Is there's I now have, you know, I've gotten a few more calls to like put music together, and I don't know if this is a common experience, but I'm realizing, like, in going out and trying to, you know, put a set of music together and write new music, sometimes I almost feel like I've been like out in the ether so long that I need to, at certain points, reconnect myself to try to figure out like, well, what is it I actually like about music, and like what am I trying to do? Because I mean, I think that can happen, is just if you're constantly living in a world without a foundational guiding principle to what you're doing, and you're always just making music that disappears the second you make it. I don't know, I find myself having to go back to like I said, like these basic principle things, where it's like, well, I love Duke Ellington, I love Johnny Hodges, and I love Sonny Rollins. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to suddenly start just, you know, playing changes in time. It's more, what are the things about what these people are doing that I can connect to my own practice and these interests that are sort of at the top of my mind. It's how do I put a foundation under them to actually, you know, make music that I feel strongly about and feel good about.
What are you working on now?
Yeah, very soon. I have a band called Nine Dog Dick. It's made up of the bass player and drummer from a sort of extreme hardcore group called Burmese, that's been sort of a Bay Area institution for more than 20 years. But the bass player and drummer from that, and then an organ player named Doug Catalyst, who is known pretty well for doing a solo organ practice that he literally just calls solo organ. And it's just kind of like psychedelic, loud organ music, really influenced by Larry Young. But this group is, so when I say this, I mean it ironically and jokingly. It's sort of a super group, but we've been rehearsing and writing basically, I don't know, since like right after the pandemic started, as we started getting together and started working on writing material. And that's really it's sort of like spaz rock. A lot of it's very heavy metal influence, but it's all group composed and pretty tightly structured, although there's a lot of room for our individual improvised vocabularies in there. But we're finally at the point where we have enough music and we have a couple of gigs to warm up, but we're going to go in and record that probably next month. So there will be a Nine Dog Dick full length album, and I think a 12-inch cover of the Miles Davis piece Rated X coming out, I'd say within the next year. But that's a big thing. And then later this month, I'm going to be playing with musicians I played with before, but never in this organization, of playing in a quartet. 2 saxophones, bass, and drums. But I've been working on a lot of new music for that, and heavily influenced by the way a lot of Anthony Braxton performances are put together. I'm kind of working with having these pieces that are fairly, through composed, but trying to work with them as like these modular pieces that can be thrown into the middle of an improvisation, or you start out playing one piece and then embed another piece within that piece. So yeah, that's another thing that I'm working on, ancillary to the other projects, is I guess you could say trying to develop a sort of Tom Weeks songbook, if you will, of tunes that I can bring in, and musicians can play them, but I don't want to just say like, all right, now here's the next piece, 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to develop that into like a free flowing, spontaneous composition where there are these moments of unison and through composed things, but those can be equally thrown in the middle of a completely free improvisation, or someone can be playing the piece and improvise over the piece simultaneously while playing it. But yeah, those are the big things I'm working on right now. And then just continuing practicing saxophone, working on that. Yeah.
So you talked about creating a songbook and your upcoming records that are coming out. You have a pretty, big collection of albums that you've recorded. What do you think it means to create a body of work as an improviser?
Again, I kind of have to, I'll refer to Anthony Braxton. I know I just did, but he, in that book by Graham Locke, Forces in Motion, which is a great book, he talks about this this notion of I think he calls it the myth of the sweating brow. And really what he's talking about is the idea that as an improviser, and it's really, I think in this case, is drawing the distinction between an improviser and essentially any other type of musician, a composer or performer. It's not so useful to draw that distinction there, because I think what it means to create a body of work as an artist, and especially as a musician, well, I take that back. Let's focus on improviser. I think if you're ever trying to create a masterpiece that is going to be, your legacy for years to come, that's the wrong approach. I think what it means to build a body of work as an improviser is to continue working and constantly be striving to continue to develop, and to keep bringing up these same names. Sonny Rollins is very famous for that. He apparently would never listen to a single recording that he made. It was it was always, you know, someone, Blue Note would hire him to make a new album, so we'd go in, record the album. As soon as it was done, he would just forget about it, and it would come out in a few months. He would never listen to it, and it's always working on developing your vocabulary and continuing to progress that, at least for me. So it's like the real danger is falling into any rut where, you know, you're pigeonholing yourself of like, oh, this is my thing, or like, oh, you know, she's the player who does, you know, the multiphonics, or he's the guy who does, you know, double tonguing real well, is like, or, you know, they're the one who plays like the really loud music all the time. I think those are like dangerous pitfalls to fall in as an improviser. So the body of work is almost not the recordings to me. I think the recordings are snapshots of a continually evolving process. And that even applies to the composed work, is at any given time, if there's like a piece that I feel good about and want to record just so I have it, that's once it's written and rehearsed and then recorded, it's sort of like, okay, done, on to the next thing. So in a sense, it's the body of work. I mean, I like some of the recordings I've made, but I'm much more interested in whatever I'm gonna do next. And honestly, like live performance, and even, you know, just sitting around practicing by myself is almost more real to me than the recordings, because the recordings are at best, like I said, just a snapshot of any particular point in the continually evolving process. So that's for instance, on the last solo record that I made, and again, I kind of took this idea from Anthony Braxton, but I didn't really give it a title. I just said alto saxophone improvisations on the date when I recorded them. It's April something 2020. And the part of the implication there is that, like, you can listen to this album, but I'm specifically not trying to make this a statement about who I am or what my music is. It's more, this is what my saxophone playing and what my ideas sounded like on April 24th, 2020. If you heard me on April 25th, it might sound nothing like that. So I don't know if this is a satisfying answer, but I truly believe what it means to build a body of work as an improviser is just to keep developing your own ideas, and to keep encountering new ideas, and, you know, playing with different people. And the more varied the ideas, the better, almost. And it's not to say it's all about ad hoc groupings. I think that can also apply to close collaborators with improvisation. I think the idea of sort of rehearsing improvisation is almost underrated a lot of times, but I really like that. I like working with the same musicians and to continue developing a group sound. It could continue to develop, you know, these dialogues and discourses that I have with a particular bass player and drummer. So in that sense, I mean, I've been playing with the same bass player for years and years now, and I play with other bass players, but Kazuto Sato is now one of my closest collaborators in terms of improvised music. And we have a trio that still exists, you know, in the ephemeral sense, with Kevin Murray, who's a great drummer who lives in New York now. But to combine what I'm saying, it's at the end of this month, Kazu and I, we're going to be playing trio with another great drummer, Gerald Cleaver, who we've never played with before. So that's part of this whole thing, is continuing to develop these dialogues with close collaborators and encountering completely new ideas that will expand the dialogue that you're having with yourself, or even that you're having with the other musicians.
Awesome, Tom. Thanks very much for chatting with us today.
No, thanks so much for taking the time. I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.